welcome everyone to this next panel on the thinking about the new big picture and the question, how has coronavirus changed our understanding on key global trends? I'd like, in fact, to pick up right where Pavel Sviboda left off at the last session, when in his summing up, he talked a lot about how we think about resilience. And I think that's probably one where there has been a very significant change over the last year, over the last 9 months. We've talked a lot about the resilience over several years. In fact, the Commission and the EAS did a joint communication on it about 2-3 years ago. But we never thought we'd have to deal with it in such very hands-on, concrete terms for our entire societies as we have done in the last 9 months. And I'd be very interested with the panelists we have today to hear their thinking about how that very direct experience also influences the way we deal with global challenges and global trends. So I'm very pleased to have with me on the panel 4 distinguished speakers. I have Dr. Florence Gaub, well known to those who've been following ESPAS over the years, as the key coordinating author of the 2030 report last year. She's the Deputy Director of the European Institute of Security Studies in Paris, works a lot on foresight, also on security and conflict in the Middle East and in North Africa, and with a past at NATO, in the German Parliament, and other places. Then we have Ian Goldin, Professor of Globalization and Development at the University of Oxford, and fellow at Balliol, Director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Technological and Economic Change, founding Director of the Oxford Martin School, with a past also at the World Bank and several other places. Author of a vast range of books, several of which are particularly interesting in this context today. The most recent, Terra Incognita, with 100 maps to survive the next century. Also, The Age of Discovery, Navigating Storms of Our Second Renaissance. And one that I'd like to maybe highlight particularly because it's an issue that's been discussed so much in Europe, Exceptional People, How Migration Shaped Our World and Will Define Our Future. I think it's very important to highlight those positive contributions of migration to how the world develops. Then I turn to Professor Gregory Treverton, who is the chair of Global Technopolitics Forum and senior advisor on the Transnational Threats Project at the CSIS in Washington, also professor of the Practice of International Relations and Spatial Sciences at the University of Southern California, with a distinguished past also in government services, including as chair of the National Intelligence Council until January 2017. Finally, Dr. Yu Jie, Senior Research Fellow on China in the Asia-Pacific Program of Chatham House at the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, looking a lot at Chinese foreign policy, China's economic diplomacy, has also worked as the head of the China Foresight Program at the LSE Ideas Program, and as a management consultant specializing in Chinese affairs. Now, may I turn first, maybe I should say, sorry, I should also say, when we've had the initial round of conversation between the panelists, there is a possibility for others in the audience to put questions to the panelists. You should do so by sending them via the WebEx chat function to the presenter, not to the host. The host deals with technical issues, so use the chat function and send your questions to the presenter, who will then pass them on to me and the panelists. Now, with that, let's enter into the subject, and I'll turn first to Professor Goldin. In your book that I already mentioned, called Terra Incognita, the 100 Maps to Survive the Next 100 Years, how much of your thinking about the forces that will shape these next 100 years has been affected, have changed during the COVID crisis? How do you think that this will now impact on the developments? And in retrospect, would you have changed any of the 100 maps?
Thank you very much, Christian, and thanks to Espas for inviting me to participate in this fascinating panel. We finished, my co-author and I, Robert Maga, finished the book. We were planning to finish it in January, and then we saw the pandemic coming. So we postponed the completion of the book, and in fact finished it in July, the first week of July. And Penguin did a quite remarkable job to have it ready in the bookshops by the end of August. In fact, one of the casualties of the pandemic was we were originally going to print in China and end up printing in Italy. So the book does take into account the pandemic, but of course only up to July. And subsequently, there's been huge developments. We talk about it in various dimensions, but my feeling is that what we will see when we look back on 2020 is that the pandemic has accelerated all the trends that we were identifying. The pandemic, I don't believe, has created new trends. It's revealed and accelerated, compressed in time, trends that would have taken maybe decades to emerge. And amongst them are these questions of inequality. It's greatly exacerbated inequalities within countries and between countries. It has served to greatly increase, I believe, the digitalization phase, which would have happened anyway. It's led to a transformation of globalization. This was happening anyway, dematerialization of globalization as countries become richer, the movement of the center of gravity of globalization to East Asia. These were trends that were underway anyway, and it's been accentuated by the pandemic. And of course, the Cold War. The tensions between the US as a power which is diminishing in global impact and China, which is rapidly resurfacing, rising. All of these things were underway, and what the pandemic has done has revealed it. It has also revealed, of course, what I focus on in my book, The Butterfly Defect, which subtitle is Why Globalization Creates Systemic Risks and What to Do About It. That globalization is a super spreader of wonderful things. We're looking forward to the vaccines. It's been spreading collaboration in science at unprecedented levels. So globalization is not slowing down in crucial dimensions, not least digital and scientific. It's accelerating, but it has also super spreading of bads. And the pandemic is an example, but so too is a financial crisis, cyber attacks, and many other negative impacts that come from hyperconnectivity, as well as the spillovers of the positives. It's wonderful 1 billion more people have got energy over the last 30 years, but that is leading to catastrophic climate change. It's wonderful that 300 million more people have antibiotics available, but that is leading to antimicrobial resistance. So how to manage all of this has been highlighted by the pandemic. The book, a book of where we use visualizations to display global trends and try and reveal the trends through time-lapse images, my sense is that it's become more relevant because we are all fascinated by maps now. We're all looking at the spread of the pandemic from Wuhan. Many of us had never heard of Wuhan in January, and whether it's how New Zealand has coped, or Vietnam has coped, or the UK has not, or the US has not, and within the US, different states, very different. Within the contrasting of how the performance is the spreading of the virus and its very differential health and economic impact has, I believe, been highlighted. And so my view is that actually maps are more important and our visualizations are more important. And I look forward to a revised edition of the book where hopefully the extraordinary changes of 2020 will be able to be captured.
As Professor Goldin mentioned, we've seen possibly a stronger shift to the east, to Asia. Certainly, we've seen that many Southeast Asian countries and East Asian countries have performed rather well in the corona pandemic. Could you tell us why you think that is? And whether you think indeed it will affect the notion of the 21st century as the Asian century?
Well, firstly, let me thank Espas to have invited me again to join this year's annual conference. I'm delighted to be here alongside with a distinguished panelist. And thank you so much, Christian, for your question. Now, let me start with your first question regarding why Asian countries seems to perform rather well in this pandemic. I think part of the reason is, firstly, these are the countries had experience with the previous pandemics like SARS and the swine flus. So that sense of public health urge very much in the mindset of the policy makers and across the region. Now, secondly, it is also the issue regarding that sense of hierarchy and respect with authority. So generally in Asia, you would not really see much resistance in terms of face mask wearing, in terms of like being following the rules. That seems to prove to be the trouble in Europe and the United States. So that sense of respect towards hierarchy, it also contributed to somehow the society we've managed to control the pandemic. And now lastly, but not least, very importantly, I think it's really the role of local communities that really put Asian countries in a different scales in terms of managing the pandemic. I mean, just to give example, in terms like in Singapore, in Japan, or in South Korea, the local community health worker play a much bigger role than just generally through the GP, in terms of contact tracing, in terms of checking people. So all the three factors adding together make the Asian countries come out rather well, very well in this pandemic. Now, to answer your second question, whether we're going to see Asian century in making, or are we going to see a China century? I think we're too quick to jump on that conclusion. Clearly, what we have seen is in this changing geopolitical space that Asian countries, not just China, but many other Asian countries have the interest in terms of writing the rules of the game for international affairs. I mean, one of a very clear example I can give is over the weekend, there's a regional comprehensive economic pact just been signed and agreed among 15 different Asian countries. Irrespective, the size and also whether they're rich countries or poor countries, but for some reason they managed to agree with each other without having a United States and European Union to play a role in here. So it clearly indicate that the countries do have intention, the Asian countries do have intention in terms of participating in the rulemaking for 21st century international politics, because largely the rules, what we have followed so far is the rules has been written after 1945, the rules which has been written after 1989, predominantly being performed by the Europeans and by the Americans. Now, I think this pandemic offered those Asian countries and also developing world opportunity that to adding their voices on the table. It is not exactly trying to challenge the existing status quo of the international order, but rather it is not to provide alternative, but just to adding a different voices, and adding extra chairs on the table to make sure their voices are being heard. Now, how successful those Asian countries will be, I think, again, we need to look into, perhaps after 5 years, look into how well they have performed economically as well as politically in terms of being able to judge their success, of whether Asian countries has fared very well in terms of playing agenda-setting rules in this international affairs, and if we can call that Asian century or not. But so far, I won't jump on the conclusion by saying we are definitely going to have an Asian century.
And to Professor Treverton, when you hear Dr. Yu, what are your thoughts about the US and the place of the US on the international stage? We have seen in the past years, particularly the past 4 years, withdrawal, waning of that, call it unique. Do you think that the US can again rely on its traditional strengths to reassert itself on the international stage in the years to come?
Well, thank you very much. And thanks also for the invitation to be on this wonderful panel. It's a very good question, one that I think is surrounded by lots of uncertainty. Certainly, a new president, a new administration, Mr. Biden has lots of relatively easy opportunities. He can return to some point, and will return to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He will rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. He will perhaps reach out to Iran. So there are many things that he can do. He can also do the right symbolism, clearly expressing support for NATO, for alliances, making early trips, if trips are possible, to Europe.
Professor Treverton, could you possibly turn down the volume, please, a little bit, because we're getting a very bad echo. Thank you.
Sorry, turn down the volume?
Yes, please.
You got it. I'm not sure I can. Not sure I can do that. Is this better?
I'm afraid we can't hear you, Professor Treverton. Could you try again?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Professor Treverton, you can proceed. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I was just saying that a new administration obviously has lots of opportunities to try and reset the tone, and I think it will. The big uncertainty, though, is we remain so deeply divided. We've been through this, are still in the middle of the response to the pandemic, which I think will qualify in terms of needless loss of life as probably the greatest failure of government in the history of the Republic. That said, we still remain so deeply divided. The number that caught my attention this election was that Mr. Biden actually flipped to Democrat 5 of the 10 richest counties that had voted for Trump in 2016. That meant that of the 470 odd counties that Biden won, they accounted for 70% of US GNP. By contrast, the 2,500 counties that Mr. Trump won accounted for 29% of US GDP. So the gap is visible everywhere, and the impulses that led to Mr. Trump may be gone, but Trumpism will still be around. So the impulses toward America first, toward anti-immigrant, toward anti-globalization, toward, and I suppose most of all, toward lack of trust in government institutions and government actions, which I think is something we share with lots of other countries, but we're probably the poster child for it. Those will continue. And just digging out from the position we put ourselves in now, most of the world doesn't always like us, but they've always thought we were competent. And this demonstration of incompetence over the last months is going to be something that will take quite a long time, I think, for us to recover from. So it may be too early to proclaim an Asian century, but it's going to be a long process, I think, for the United States to try and resume the kind of position looked to as a leader that we have historically regarded ourselves as occupying.
the ESPAS report last year on trends and challenges up to 2030. You talked there of mega trends such as climate change and digitalization, and you noted they cannot easily be turned around by humans or by individuals. I think that was already alluded to also in the intervention by Professor Goldin. It would be interesting to hear your perspective in light of the COVID pandemic on how you see these trends evolving. You also, in the report last year, pointed to what you call catalysts and game changers, not as overriding as the mega trends, but can speed them up, the acceleration that Professor Goldin talked about, or can tip them as game changers. How would you see COVID? Would you see it as a game changer, as a catalyst, or is it even an emanation of an underlying megatrend?
Good to see you again, Christian, even though it's just on video and not in person. I think the answer is it's in a way all of the above. So the first thing is it's of course a product, or it is a product of at least three megatrends. The first being of course connectivity. You know, if you weren't as connected as we are, this virus wouldn't have spread. The second is urbanization. We know that it spreads, it spreads where humans are, and the more humans there are, the better for the virus. And lastly, of course, it is also a phenomenon of demography, not because of sheer agglomeration, but it has hit societies harder that have older and unhealthy adults. And I think that's something that we miss in the discussion on Asia. Why has Asia done so much better? I'll come back to that point in a second. But one of the reasons is that Asian adults age much better than Europeans. And, you know, we pointed that out in the ESPAS report, that obesity, especially above a certain age, is not good. And the WHO warned us. And I think the casualties that we see from COVID are in part because of our health demographic. So we kind of knew that. So these three trends together have been amplified, or have amplified COVID in a way. COVID has amplified them, and they are the result, or they underpin COVID. But it's also a catalyst, as Ian Golding said, catalyst, for those of you who didn't pay attention in chemistry, as I did, is an element of acceleration. And of course, it is an accelerator of certain trends. The question is why? A crisis like COVID can rearrange priorities. It creates a sense of urgency. It reallocates resources or unblocks resources that perhaps before you didn't have access to. And interestingly enough, it creates also conditions whereby humans become really creative at finding a solution to the problem. So it has the potential of unlocking a lot of different things. And therefore it is a catalyst, but I think it also has the potential to create new trends. And I'll come back to it in a second. So of course it has accelerated digitalization. We're talking now on Zoom. I think that's the obvious point. It also has worsened our relations, I think, with China. They weren't already great before. I think during the pandemic, they took a turn for the worse, and so forth. Where I say it creates the potential for trends, why am I cautious on this? Well, I would not rule it out completely, but I think, what is a trend? A trend is a pattern of change. A trend is something that has to occur over several years. So of course, even a year into the crisis, I cannot really tell you whether there will be new trends or not. We'll have to wait. Where I do see potential for new trends is, for instance, in our attitude to health. I think until COVID, we thought healthcare is health. Now we know that the best healthcare does not protect you if your health isn't that great. I also think that it has changed our perception. Now, if that's a trend, I don't know yet, but it has changed our perception of living in cities. The conversation on well-being in cities, nature, the way we move around in cities and so forth, that was not really underway before COVID. We knew that cities were growing and we want to make them livable, but I think that COVID has really given a new a new dimension to this. And there are a few other things, the way we relate to technology. We always discussed that digitalization will probably lead to something like our conversation now on WebEx. But we also discover that actually we like being with our colleagues. We like human beings. So I think there's a new conversation unfolding about human relations, about social networks in the real world. So I think the over-digitalization that we've experienced in 2020, I think might lead to some, I'm going to say, re-evaluation of some classical things like nature, like social relationships. And at the end of the day, we always come back to human beings. Perhaps if I can add just one quick thing on what you said earlier about Asia doing better. We did a study at the EOISS in April, May, and we compared the different countries and how they fared. And we found that not culture, not political system, no level of development played the major role in how a state responded. There was a single ingredient, and that was previous experience with SARS. So even the compliance with face masks, which, by the way, I'm going to share a link later on in the chat, is actually extremely high. It's over 80% in all European states that have made them mandatory or recommended them. But it took them a little while to accept them. And I think this is where the previous experience is important. So I wouldn't quite agree with, this cultural notion that Europeans aren't just good at following orders. I mean, they like to discuss things first, I think. But at the end of the day, despite all the drama that is out there, you will find that acceptance rate of face masks and hand washing, etc., in the end has been rather high. Certainly, the next pandemic, we will have a much higher compliance rate from the outset, as was the case in China, which had experience with SARS, with the swine flu, etc., etc. So has COVID changed the future? In some ways, certainly yes. In others, not. But I think what it has done, one way or the other, is given us a moment to reflect on how it has affected certain trends and how we want to shape them, because it has unlocked resources, priorities, etc., etc.
Let me turn back to the panelists in no particular order. I think it would be interesting to hear your reactions to the interventions of your colleagues. One thing that, in terms of looking at global trends and challenges in our interpretation of it, Dr. you talked about, in fact, about multilateralism, adding voices at the table and working on the agenda setting. I mean, this is one thing that has been discussed quite a lot within the EU in terms of defense of multilateralism, but whose multilateralism and how do we look at it? I would be interested to hear from panelists how you would see that evolving. Is the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic, something that might reinforce multilateralism because of the need to actually work together, or is it something that drives us apart? And either way, whose multilateralism is it? Who would like to come in on that?
I'm happy to start, and I certainly very much valued the co-presenters' comments. I think on your specific question, if this pandemic has taught us one thing, it's that we need multilateralism. In fact, pandemics are the only thing that need all countries in the world to participate. Most other global threats, you could apply the Pareto principle to, which is 20% of the actors could make 80% of the difference to stopping a pandemic. That's certainly true of climate change, where a dozen countries account for 80% of emissions. It's true of antimicrobial resistance, where New York State produces consumes more antibiotics than the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. It's true of financial crises. It's true of many other dimensions that a small number of actors actually could solve most of the problem. But it's not true of pandemics, where you need everyone to participate. And if there's one thing that it's taught us, is not only that we need it, but actually it works. One of the astounding things about this pandemic, the surprises for me, has been that the most sophisticated countries with the best science have done the worst. Let's take the US as the prime example, but the UK and Europe prides itself on its levels of science and expertise, and has done astoundingly badly. France hasn't done very well either. Greece has done much, much better. So there clearly is no correlation between wealth or expertise and one's ability to manage this threat. But what there is a correlation with is one's ability to listen to multilateral organizations. And it's partly that if one has too much wealth and expertise, one is arrogant and doesn't listen to the multilateral institutions. Just on the bigger question, I think what the pandemic has also done is broken taboos. And what was impossible in January is now orthodox now, not least with government expenditures and also our behavior changes. And that creates opportunities. For Europe, I think this is a real crossroads time, because Europe, there's a Cold War the US has started, which seems to have bilateral support, although clearly President Biden will handle it differently to Trump. But all the presidential candidates on the Democrat side were united in their attacks on China. And for Europe, it's an extremely strategic time. My own personal view is it would be a huge mistake for Europe to side with the US on this, because to solve climate change, to stop pandemics, to make the world prosper, and to create a more inclusive and sustainable globalization requires China's active participation. There's no problem that can be solved without China being at the table. Even the problems which only require a small number of actors require China. And that means that although we would disagree with them fundamentally on human rights questions, and I believe that is a question that needs to be pursued, it should not get in the way of fixing, reforming, empowering the multilateral system. The final point I'll make, having been in many multilaterals and on the UN Reform Task Force, is I used to beat up on the multilaterals and feel they were totally incompetent and unfit for purpose. And I now, in retrospect, feel this was totally unfair on them. We should beat up on our own governments, because we are the shareholders. They can only do what we permit them to do. They can only be as good as we allow them, resource them, reform them, etc. If we make them political institutions, if we resource them, and if we don't allow the reforms they urgently need, we shouldn't be surprised if they're ineffective. And so the challenge for Europe, and I think it's a challenge it has to confront with the US and with China, along with other big players, is how to make these organizations fit for purpose. Let's start with the most important issues and make sure this is the last pandemic. Are we in the First World War, or are we in the Second World War? And that really is the question that should be on all of our minds. Do we have the foresight that the leaders in the Second World War had to create a new world system, or are we in the cycle of the leadership of the First World War, which would be a very tragic, wasted opportunity?
And here, whether he agrees with this analysis and how the US would react, or what expectations are there in the US, including the incoming administration, of working with Europe, with China or against China, and in defense of what international order?
I want to pick up Professor Golden's last point and connect it to your question. I've always said that the UN is in the end nothing more than a collection of buildings on First Avenue. He's exactly right that these multilateral institutions are only what we choose to make of them. And I do hope that we can recognize, as we change administrations, as he put it, we cooperating with China on pandemics and climate is not a luxury, it's required. So the challenge for a Biden administration will be to see if it can walk and chew gum at the same time. He's right that all the Democratic candidates were pretty anti-China in the debates, but I think we will see a much more sophisticated approach to China. Mr. Biden, I think, understands that the best way to deal with China on intellectual property and the other things where we have real grievances is to organize like-minded countries, organize our allies, not impose tariffs on them, but organize those allies to work with us to try and make progress, make real progress. Mr. Trump did get China's attention with his tariffs, but then he didn't follow through. He just continued with tariffs, which in the end cost us taxpayers money and didn't induce the Chinese to move. What it will take is putting together a coalition of like-minded states. One of the big consequences of the pandemic that we haven't talked about is really supply chains. We've had the expectation that supply chains after the pandemic would shorten, tighten. People would tend to value resilience more than sheer efficiency. I think it's very much an open question. China is still a very big market and a very big place to sell things. So my sense is that probably we may have hyped the change in supply chains. But like so many other things about the aftermath of this current and aftermath of the coronavirus, there's enormous uncertainty. I think only time will tell exactly what happens with supply chains in the wake of the crisis.
Which to turn to Dr. Yu. China, in the rise of its economy over the last 20, 25 years, has relied very much on those global supply chains. As a newly assertive actor on the global stage, on the multilateral stage, it's also been very much looking at ways of contributing to the agenda setting or influencing the agenda setting in multilateral institutions. How do you see the pandemic affecting that role of China, both in terms of political legitimacy on the multilateral stage, in the multilateral arena, but also in its economic model and how to preserve that in a world where supply chains may be shortened, may become more local, or will we be able to preserve a truly integrated global economy?
Well, let me tackle the first question, how economic model that would switch. I mean, while the rest of the world really focusing on the US election in the last 3 weeks or so, and Chinese Communist Party also dropped big documents. The 14th 5 years plan is not exactly about 5 years plan, but actually 15 years plan. And Xi Jinping is talking about building a resilient and self-sufficient Chinese economy. Now, Chinese economic planners and try to entertain this idea of the so-called dual circulation. What I mean by dual circulation in here, it is to switch in the gear from China's export-oriented economy into very much based on domestic production and domestic consumption. So enterprises used to producing things for export and actually produced for domestic consumption. And therefore, it's all very much just based on the whole idea is that China will have to building an economic cycle by itself. I think part of the reason, there are two reasons in here. And firstly, as the Chinese leadership indicated very clearly, that international environment will be far less benevolent for China, will be far less accommodating for China. Even this is probably even worse than after 1980, 1910 and crisis. And that's one thing. And secondly, it is also, China has been talking about this whole sense of economic rebalancing for many years. So this whole idea of building a resilient and self-sufficient economy is very much that repackaging of the so-called economic rebalancing, which China has been talking in the past 25 years or so. Now, what is really for the rest of the world? Instead of perhaps the word I've noticed Christian use, the assertive China, we would probably perhaps to see a more reluctant China to be perhaps less interested in expanding its voices on the international stage, but instead more focusing on managing its own domestic affairs and try to manage that well. And whether they can manage the economy properly, I'm not sure. Even given the current positive economic growth in China, it's still not sufficient enough to generating enough jobs in order to increasing that domestic consumption. So the Chinese economic model is indeed switching gear. And whether that will be successful or not, it's too early to jump to conclusion. Now, secondly, this will be talking about this will impact on China's international role. Now, when we're talking about multilateralism, when we're talking about multilateral organizations, I think one thing that China has been quite puzzled in the recent years is that actually there are rules for multilateral institutions, but unfortunately, there is a big power in the room did not follow the rule. I mean, for example, for President Biden, if he's seriously would like to have a trade negotiation with China, the so-called Phase 2 trade deal between China and the United States, it would rather actually go to WTO by using WTO organizations and to regulate China's unfair trade practices. So we do have the multilateral institutions in place, but again, it depends on the willingness of how major member states will be able to utilize those organizations and utilize them very well. So these institutions exist, but it's very much, again, depends on member states. So the power competition in here would be replayed.
Florence, if I may turn back to you and maybe introduce another dimension close to your function at the EU ISS in Paris. That is, how do you think the COVID crisis affects our perception of security? And in light of what we've been talking about here and some of the examples given by the other panelists, do you think that we have learned lessons to make the world over time safer or less safe? And is it affecting our deeper understanding of security and what security of our society and security for our citizens means and how we have to address it?
It's a very interesting question, but it's also a difficult one, because I think one of the problems we have with these types of questions is that they pose binary choices. So one of the first questions that was asked at the beginning of the pandemic was, what will the pandemic do to conflicts? Will it make them more violent or less violent? What about terrorism, more or less? But I think at the end of the day, the answer is never straightforward, yes or no, or black or white. Now, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, the Islamic State, for instance, issued a statement saying that its fighters should avoid Europe. But I think that lured some people, it got a lot of media coverage because a lot of people thought, I think that was funny. But it perhaps created the illusion that we were kind of done with terrorism. And of course, for the people working on this, like myself, we always knew that now quite the contrary. The Islamic State is, like any terrorist organization, opportunistic, and it will seize every moment it can to, well, create a sense of fear in our society. So we always knew that there were other declarations by the Islamic State, less covered by the media, clearly calling for exploitation of the situation. Now, I think what security reforms in Europe have achieved is that you can no longer really drive into a crowd, and it's going to be increasingly difficult to conduct more dramatic terrorist attacks. But we know that about the knives and the cars for at least 4 or 5 years. And I think, that the problem here is that public perception, indeed human beings in general, cannot focus on more than 3 to 5 problems at a time. And since we're so absorbed with the pandemic, we get the impression that the other problems have disappeared, but they keep on evolving. Now, we also looked at conflicts in general at the EU ISS, and here too, we found a very diverging picture. It's just, you cannot say that the pandemic has created more conflict or less, but it has created an opening. Like what I said earlier, it creates opportunities for people who want to exploit opportunities. So, for instance, in Ukraine, where a lockdown was imposed just recently, levels of violence have gone down, but that's probably because people have stayed at home, not because there's been a peace agreement. So as soon as the lockdown is lifted, we might see a return to violence. We have, of course, situations like Belarus or elsewhere, or Nagorno-Karabakh, where the pandemic actually perhaps has accelerated violence because people felt that the big brother is not watching at the moment, be it the United States or Europeans or whoever, and therefore seized the window. Or elsewhere, people will be generally absorbed with the pandemic. So I think the answer is not clear-cut to your questions, but, well, security, perhaps the answer is not clear-cut. Perception, I think, Europeans today feel less safer, but I think that's not necessarily because there's a terrorist incident or because there's violence in Libya or in Syria, but because overall their sense of security has been shaken by an event that the vast majority of them did not see that coming. And I think it's more about that, what you call in German Urvertrauen, this basic trust that the world is what it is, and you will continue waking up to the world that you know tomorrow. That has been shaken. And in that sense, I agree with Ian Golding on using the term world war, because it's of course not a world war, but like a world war, it has shaken a sense of certainty. And if you allow me to say so, although it's painful for everybody, including myself, I think that's not a bad thing, because I think Europeans have become complacent. There was, and not just Europeans, I think Americans, Westerners in general, thought that, the life or purpose in general is about, going on holiday, getting a good job, buying the next Apple iPhone. And at the strategic level, we have always struggled to get popular support for understanding the world as it is, a potentially conflictual one where Europeans have to do more together, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that wake-up call, quite honestly, was probably necessary.
Now, we've received quite a lot of questions from the broader audience. So I'd like to turn to the panelists and highlight some of these questions and get your reactions. But I'd ask you to be quite brief in your answers so that we can get through as many of them as possible. First, a couple of questions on sort of a geographical dimension. There's been a question of, we've talked here a lot about Europe, North America, and Asia, China and Asia. But there are many other parts of the world. Florence Gaub, you work a lot on the Middle East. And how do you think this has affected or will affect the Middle East? The tensions that are there, the conflicts that are there, will this force some of them to come together, or will it be a further centrifugal force to aggravate a number of the conflicts there? I'd jump in there too and highlight the challenges in Africa and in Latin America. In Africa, we have seen over the past decade or so, or even a little longer, patchy but still remarkable progress in poverty reduction. Will they be able to stand up to these challenges? They've been less affected than others so far, but Professor Goldin, you've worked a lot in Africa and with Africa, so maybe you would have some views on the socio-economic resilience in Africa. In Latin America, we had 20 years of economic progress, very unequally shared, and of democratic progress, although it already slowed down over the last 3, 4, 5 years. But we've now seen enormous tension in a number of Latin American societies provoked by COVID, not just Brazil, but Mexico, Peru, Chile, Colombia, others. Will this push back on those trends in Latin America, or can it be used as an accelerator to overcome those challenges? Who would like to come in on any of those?
I'm happy to come in on the Middle East. Now, it's obviously not a secret to anybody that the Middle East wasn't in a great situation before the pandemic hit. It has, all over the region, experienced unrest, violence, demonstrations, severe clashes between the police and citizens in Iraq, in Algeria, of course, wars in Libya, and conflict also continued in Syria, despite to some claims that the conflict is over. Lebanon, the list is endless, pretty much. And as analysts, we've warned of, Arab decision makers are in the driver's seat. This is not a curse that has fallen onto the region. The pandemic might be something that's exogenous, but most of the problems that are happening in the region are created by governments themselves. So high youth unemployment, bad governance, corruption, you name it, are all the result of just severe, decades of mismanagement. And into this, the pandemic is really the one thing that was not necessary. Obviously, There are a few things perhaps to be borne in mind when you talk about COVID in the Middle East, North Africa. The first thing is the oil price has collapsed because of decreased economic activity everywhere in the world. So the governments that are exporting oil, normally the wealthier ones, they suddenly saw their government budget contract severely. Secondly, these are not knowledge economies. So, I mean, even in Europe, not all European states are fully knowledge economies, but let's say digitalization is not nearly as advanced as in Europe. So you get people who had to stay at home. I mean, the lockdown option was never really an option. So the economy had to continue operating, but was severely shaken. Tourism, for instance, one of the major sources of income in Egypt and Tunisia, obviously fell away. So as a result, and I think perhaps that's the only thing that was the only card that they had in the deck that was better for them than for us, has been the demographics, because they have a younger population that overall has been, less hit by the crisis in health terms. But the older ones, of course, they are undergoing the same dramatic instances as in Europe, with a healthcare system that does not have what we have. So, if you allow my French, it's a shit sandwich. Unfortunately, what I do not see happening yet is that decision makers understand that now is the time to really change certain things. I mean, you look at Lebanon, the same government, the same prime minister, the same faces, the same solutions that aren't solutions to a problem. So you hear the exasperation in my voice, because I think this is an opportunity that really should not be missed. We have negotiations ongoing concerning Libya at the moment. The United Nations is moderately optimistic that maybe this will lead to something. Personally, I am, but not overly optimistic. I am afraid what needs to happen is that there is another wave of demonstrations. We already saw it even during the pandemic, because the lockdown was not as enforced as, for instance, in Europe. That people demonstrate against the government and probably resort to violent means. What frustrates me perhaps the most is that analysts like myself have warned of this repeatedly. And I think there is a European fallacy to think this type of demonstration leads to another Arab Spring, which leads to Islamists, which is not good for us. But I think we're thinking this the wrong way around. The only option we have in Europe is to support transition to better governance, whether it's democracy or not. It has to deliver what the people need, and it's not delivering. So unfortunately, the news on the Middle East, very grim today, Christian.
I'm happy to say something about Africa, maybe. On Africa, the situation, I think, is dire. The health emergency has been much less severe than was anticipated, except in South Africa, where there was a very quick and severe lockdown. And there's all sorts of speculation as to what the reasons for that are, ranging from demographics to high levels of prior immunity for various reasons, including multi-shot tuberculosis and other vaccines. But the evidence is not clear, and the testing levels are so low in many countries that it's not clear that there is a low incidence of the pandemic. In countries like Tanzania, there's a lot of denialism as well. And it could well be that things change now as winter approaches, particularly in North Africa, that we see very, very sharp upticks, as we've seen in Egypt already. But many more people will die of starvation than will die of the pandemic. This was always clear that would be the case. And the real emergency in Africa is an economic emergency, a hunger emergency, an education emergency. And when you look at the data which have been coming out of the World Bank and other institutions, it really is extremely dismal. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, have been completely derailed. 30 years of progress in reducing poverty have been reversed. About 100 million more people minimum thrown into extreme poverty this year. And it's the combination of different economic factors: loss of export earnings, loss of tourism earnings, loss of remittances from migrant workers, lower tax take in countries through lower levels of economic activity, and therefore less expenditure on various items. certainly what we've seen is declining currencies. On average, African currencies have gone down over 20%. The credit rating agencies have not helped. I believe they've had a very perverse system because they're downgrading countries that accept moratorium. The rich countries have found $12 trillion for themselves. Less than 100 billion has been allocated to developing countries. That's 1%. Aid budgets are going down. The UK is now talking about a £5 billion reduction in aid budgets on top of the reduction in GNI. This is a time that help has never been needed more and has never been less forthcoming. And I think that is a major, major challenge. In addition to all of this, in a world of trade protectionism and increasing regionalism, we've seen this huge new Asian trade deal, RCEP, taking off in recent weeks. Interestingly, for the first time, not including the US. Europe, Africa is nowhere to be seen. And I see this as a very, very worrying time for Africa, both from a development point of view, but also from how do you get away from this point of view. And the only solution, in my view, is a massively stepped up program of assistance, including what was done in the 90s with the writing off of debt of the most highly indebted countries. But that requires global leadership. That was the US then, and Europe that came to that, with the UK very active. And we'll need to see whether that's going to come out of a Biden presidency. But my view is that Europe needs to take the lead on this.
These comments, or for that matter, also on developments south of the border, so to speak, in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere?
I think one big thing which we have learned in this pandemic is it's not about that political system make differences. I think at the end of the day is that irrespective which political system you are, it's the accountability between the governors and those who've been governed that matters. You know, the accountability that the governors will have to take care into account. I mean, just to give an example for China's case, and what really kept the Chinese president waking up in the middle of the night. It is not the Sino-US relations, it's not the incoming new Cold War. It's actually the glaring economic inequality between rich and poor inside China. And because of the pandemic, that made the whole thing even worse for those disadvantaged group that matters. I mean, equally that would apply for Latin America. So if I'm saying that if China wants to, again, perform the so-called pandemic diplomacy or vaccine diplomacy, the focus shouldn't really be in European countries and United States, but should be in developing countries, but followed by the science, do not follow by the diplomacy and politics.
A very valid comment. A quick shoot back to you, which has to do with the RCEP trade deal, but also with setting the international, the global agenda. Yes, the RCEP brings together economies that make up a large part of the global economy, the very large part being China, the other large part in Asia, India, having decided to stay out. RCEP is also notable for its very modest level of ambition. It's stepping in, but it's not really stepping up. It's still an important step, but is that, let's say, is that an illustration of a different approach, a much more cautious, small steps, one by following another, rather than if we look at the TPP that failed ultimately, or that didn't fail, but it was redefined and became smaller than was expected. And do you see this? And I then turn to Professor Treverton to hear his views on this too. Is this a shift from, if you like, at the global level, multilateralism to multi-regionalism, where the regionalism can then be building blocks in a multilateral world?
Well, essentially, it is about making impacts and rules. I mean, if you actually look into the chapters on the RCEP, on data and on service trade, actually the chapter is very thin in comparison to, tariff and goods. So to some extent, it's about Asian countries, almost like a pilot study, a test for making the rules and creating the rules rather than bring any real economic impact so far for China. So for me, RCEP is more about a political gain rather than an economic gain.
I fear it is a harbinger of the times. That is, the days when we had these grand global rounds of tariff cutting and other reductions in barriers, I think are not with us any longer. Small steps are probably the best that we can do in this current environment where the suspicion of globalization is growing almost everywhere. It's better than nothing, I suppose, is how I would put it. It's small steps, but better small steps than nothing. And the next steps are very difficult. We haven't done much about digital trade. It's been sort of the stepchild in all these agreements. So the agenda is there. And in this climate, though, I think the best we can do is small steps to try and lay the basis for broader agreements that take us into new terrain, like the digital realm.
And turning back to Professor Goldin's question, Professor Treverton, how do you see the chances of building again a global coalition to step up and support the most vulnerable? Dr. Yu also mentioned this, looking at developing countries rather than what happens in the developed parts of Asia, Europe, and North America.
Well, the good news, if we could say there's any good news in this pandemic, is that many of the poorer countries have both handled the pandemic better than we have, for reasons we're not entirely clear about, as Professor Goldin said. And also, so far, the economic damage has not been as great, though the pockets of real hardship, and he referred to those in Africa, in Latin America, similar problems, but haven't been on the whole as bad as we might have expected. Now, what comes next? That's clear. We know that the world is going to have a very slow recovery, and that'll mean hardships for those commodity producers in Latin America, oil producers, as we talked about elsewhere. That seems to me to be the prospect. The chances of us in the short run putting together a grand bargain to try and do something for the most vulnerable in the world, these are probably not good times for that. I hope that though the pandemic can make us realize that we really are all inhabitants of the same planet, and therefore in the longer run, short run, I'm pessimistic. Longer run, I hope that this will drive us as it changes our notions of human security. We now realize that the only two existential threats we face on this planet are pandemics in the short run and climate change in the longer run. And that ought to at least make us recognize that we do share this lonely planet, and that ought to take us in the direction of trying to think of things we can do to make the lives of the worst off better. As I say, not optimistic in the short run, but maybe in the slightly longer run, yes.
Let me highlight one element that's been touched on. We've talked a lot about governance at the global level, but not very much about governance at the national level. Dr. Yu mentioned it, saying that what would keep the Chinese leaders awake at night is not relations with Washington or with Europe or with any other part of the world, but relations with their own people. Dare I say this might be the case in many other parts of the world, including in Europe, where we are currently discussing this. And it would be interesting to see how you feel this might redefine that relationship between governments and the governed. There's a big debate in Europe about whether the COVID pandemic will help and support populists, whether it will fuel populism, or whether, in fact, it has shown that populist models, be they in Europe or elsewhere, have not worked, and that therefore people tend to turn back to more, sort of, if you like, more traditional forms of government insofar as they trust their governments at all. Is there anybody who would want to come with a short question on this and how this might affect our respective self-views, how we view ourselves vis-a-vis ourselves and on the international stage?
One of the strong
Yeah,
One
go
of the
ahead.
striking things in the United States has been, since the federal government was largely absent in the pandemic, the states and cities did step up. Similarly, in the climate area, where we've had an absent federal government, California has in effect become America for climate. So I think there is real promise in new actors. These smaller units of government tend to be more pragmatic, closer to the voters, therefore more trusted. That's one dimension I think will be a significant change as we think about the future of multilateralism. We need to find ways to incorporate those lower levels of government, cities, states, and European and other equivalents. The second thing that the pandemic has driven home is the critical importance of the private sector, which is at the margins of existing multilateral arrangements. Somehow, when the Gates Foundation spends more on health in Africa than the World Health Organization, times have changed, and we need to find ways to bring major private actors, both for-profit and not-for-profit, into our multilateral arrangements. That's, I think, a big task before us.
Christian, if you allow me to come in on
Yeah.
populists. So
Go ahead.
we looked at the surveys, and we saw, at least in the first 6 months of the pandemic, no rise in support for populists. But of course, with time that erodes. And I think that's why it's very important to keep in mind that we're still in the pandemic, and the actual end of the game will be afterwards. So people will be judged afterwards, not during. We saw a survey just was it 2 or 3 weeks ago, showing that in France, while Macron would be re-elected if the elections were this Sunday, Marine Le Pen would come into the second round and be his opponent. And of course, populists in Europe have been very clever in surfing the anti-mask movement wave, anti-vaccine movement, etc., etc. But the center still holds. And I think that's now the challenge for all the governments to make sure that the transition, I think there are different components, that the transition through this pandemic happens in the best possible way, I think, obviously from an economic point of view. But I think the other thing is also the explanatory element. And personally, I think we can do much better at explaining why in the second wave we're using almost the same tools as during the first one. I think this is where the learning curve for our leaders is as steep as for everybody else, that this is not just about a pandemic, it's about a pandemic in the 21st century, where everybody can surf the web and find out what the latest is in terms of science and have an opinion on it. And I think communicating what are the elements that you base this decision on, explain why you took that decision, I think the public expects that. So I think we need to get out a little bit of this paternalistic approach and be better at explaining to people why certain steps are being taken as we move forward, because the crisis will remain with us until, well, I would say at least the second half of 2021. And to deflate the populists, I think that will be necessary.
Maybe just to add to that, I think very much the jury's out. The fact that 9 million more people in the US voted for President Trump this time than in 2016 is, to me, a very disturbing trend. And that clearly on the Senate and in the Congress, the Democrats didn't do much better. There's a whole parallel universe of different information out there, and social media, I think, is a major source of that. And also, following the financial crisis, high unemployment and lower incomes, particularly in Southern Europe, were accompanied by increased radicalization and support for extremist parties. I don't think we would have President Trump in the White House or Brexit in Britain if it hadn't been for the financial crisis. So these events can have dramatic political consequences. And to me, what really is key is how our government's going to respond. How is this fiscal stimulus going to lead to more inclusive growth going forward? How is it going to overcome unemployment? Those are the questions. And unless it does, I think we will see a rise in extremism. If we're able to use this opportunity to create Green New Deals, if, like President Roosevelt saw, we are able to create different societies and reinforce the welfare state, I think the center will hold, but I certainly don't think we can take it for granted.
Only literally a couple of minutes left. I'd like to turn back to you for a very quick 30 seconds, 1 minute max each to say, what do you take away from this? What might you see as the next mega trend coming, or which one resurges? I thought it was interesting, apart from Professor Treverton in his last intervention, no one has mentioned climate change over the last hour and a quarter, or barely mentioned it. Climate change will still be there, and we won't find a vaccine against it. It requires different kinds of action. Will that rise back to the top of the agenda once there is a better way of handling COVID? Or do you think that this has changed the agenda and we will see other issues really rising to the fore? I'll turn first to Dr. Yu because you didn't get a chance in the last round. So I'll turn first to you, and literally 30 seconds, 40 seconds each.
Well, climate change, certainly. I would say I'm going to pick up one policy consistency between domestic politics and foreign affairs in China. That's going to be climate change. But again, I still like to stress the message for the rest of the world is about economic inequality for those who have and for those who have not. And that's perhaps going to be a mega trend we're going to expect it.
I think climate change will rise to the top of the agenda again. We talked a little bit about national security. I think this should launch a serious rethink about what we mean by national security when the two existential threats are climate change and pandemics. And we found in the United States that we spent trillions of dollars and way too many lives in the Middle East for essentially no enduring outcome. That alone should have driven a change in our notions of national security, but I think that the coronavirus pandemic will make us rethink what national security means.
Thank you. Professor Goldin.
Yeah, I think just building on what Professor Treverton has said, I think the crucial question is, are we fighting the next war rather than the last war? And we devote 1,000 times or more attention to military than we do to pandemics. Pandemics are a much greater threat. And similarly, climate change and others. So we're at a crossroads, and it really is a question of whether we are prepared to work together to overcome these shared challenges. I would say climate and pandemics are there, but there are also many others. And if we don't, then we're in a sort of world of increasing protectionism, nationalism, and rising challenges. So it's an absolutely critical moment, and everything is to play for.
Thank you. Last but not least, Florence Gao.
Well, I would really hope that what we make of this depends on what we make of this. So I really would hope that we learn some important lessons here that will be useful for the future. I think before the pandemic hit, Europe had perhaps not the sense of innovation. It didn't have the sense of flexibility. It didn't realize that it could adapt to a massive challenge like this one in the way that it has. So I think that when we come out of it, we will feel better about ourselves, about our capacities, which brings me to, I think, the most important thing here, the thing that has changed and that perhaps will create a new trend in itself, is, I think, the prise de conscience, the awareness in Europe that our best bet for the future is ourselves, Europeans. And I think that, when we look at trends, the Global Trends Report is a European outlook on the world. We don't look at Europe itself so much, but I think Europe has already changed because of the pandemic. The whole push for about European strategic sovereignty or autonomy, or no matter what you want to call it, has really, really been driven forward also by the pandemic. And I think that's nothing to be discarded. And I also think that ultimately, as I said earlier, the wake-up call was necessary. We will be judged at the end of it. So I think I want to end on a positive note, because people are frustrated, they're tired, they want to go back to a life as it was before. But I think ultimately, if we use this moment right, and that brings me to climate change, we actually can use this for a number of reasons that will help us in the future. First thing is reallocation of supply chains. This is, of course, at the moment a strategic conversation, but what many people forget is that actually it has a relationship with climate change. What is that? At the moment, most of or large majority of our supply chains run through areas that are in vulnerable routes when it comes to climate change. So reallocating supply chains is good for us in more ways than one. Secondly, health. If we think of health as something that we use to prevent, to actually build our health resilience, that will have a ripple effect for demographics. So that will mean that we can age better, that we can have longer and happier lives, that we don't have to rely, we know that we're shrinking and getting older as Europeans, but maybe we can do that better too. And we warned of that in the report as well. So I think there's a number of things, a number of changes that we are undertaking today where in hindsight, in 2030, when we sit down and have a much better internet connection to have this conversation, we will say, you know what, we used 2020 and became much better because of it. Of course, at the moment, we don't feel that, but I really am convinced that if we seize the moment, we will get it right. And on climate change, lastly, we didn't talk about it, but I think it's fairly obvious that the European Commission's priorities have not changed. The Green Deal, the green recovery is something that's very much happening. Perhaps I would say that a real opportunity was missed when helping the European airlines, which overall got support from Europeans without any climate conditions attached. That I will criticize, but I think other than that, I think we are using the opportunity, we're using the crisis as much as we can. So I'm going to end on a positive note.
Thank you to all four panelists for a very rich discussion. I'm not surprised that we ran out of time. You came with many thoughtful and thought-provoking comments that we will need to take with us and reflect further on. Just in some key words, I would say, I think I'm encouraged by the comments on globalization and multilateralism that the COVID pandemic, I liked what Professor Golding talked about the COVID as an accelerator or a super spreader of globalization. In fact, giving that a real jolt, working then through multilateralism as well. The way we see security and the pandemic as part of a security definition, in sort of affecting traditional security, but also helping us to look at it in a different way. And in that context, of course, bringing us back to the overriding challenge of climate change and what that means for the security and stability of our societies. And lastly, the focus on resilience as a way of rebuilding and holding our societies together and overcoming the challenges of inequality that have been so much aggravated by the crisis in many parts of the world. With that, thank you very much to all four of you, and my apologies to the organizers, the hosts, for overrunning by a few minutes. Thank you.